These are the beginning notes for Slice 11, Evolution, Part 1. These are the notes for the theories of evolution. And so make sure that you have the note sheet handy with you as you're listening to this so you can take the notes. We'll divide this first set of notes, Part 1, the theories of evolution, into four essential questions. Um, Essential question number 1, explain Lamarck's theory and why it was wrong. Essential question number 2, who is Charles Darwin? What is his theory of evolution? Essential question number 3, what is natural selection? And what evidence did Darwin see that helped him form his theory? And essential question number 4, explain how the process of natural selection occurs with some examples. So we look at some of the essential vocabulary that we'll be looking at today and throughout this particular slice. Homologous structure, vestigial structures, embryology, natural selection, half-life, theory, mutation, analogous, relative dating, absolute dating, adaptation, mimicry, and species. My suggestion would be to, once you take the notes, to make flashcards with these essential vocabulary so that you will know and be able to use these vocabulary words on a concept check or on a lab. So if we look at the first question, explain who Lamarck is and why his theory was wrong. Lamarck was pre-Darwin, and what makes him worth talking about is that he was the first scientist to ever say or give a reason why and how organisms change over time and how organisms adapt to their environment. If we look at excuse me, what he theorized, he explained that organisms changed over time by what's called acquired traits. An organism acquired a trait throughout its lifetime and then passed on that particular trait to their offspring. For instance, if you look at the giraffes here, at one point in time, all giraffes had short necks, and they got longer because they stretched and stretched to reach the leaves of the tree, and over time they acquired the trait of having a stretched neck. But we, of course, know that he was wrong, primarily because, let's say, you were in the kitchen cutting up some vegetables and you cut off your finger. You, according to Lamarck, you then would have acquired the trait of being fingerless, and that if you had children, all your children would be born without that particular finger. And of course, we know that that theory has been proven wrong, and so that's what we're going to talk about. Alfred Wallace is another scientist worth mentioning because he had the same idea independently, and he had an idea similar to what Darwin said of natural selection by means of survival of the fittest. Darwin and Wallace published their idea around the same time. The difference was Wallace didn't have as much evidence as Darwin to suggest this idea of natural selection. So if we look at question number 2, who is Charles Darwin? What is his theory of evolution? Darwin was a naturalist in the 1800s, and he traveled on a ship called the HMS Beagle to the Galapagos Islands off the coast of South America. He observed lots of different specimens on his travels. He studied his samples, he took note of his samples, and he thought about how his discoveries he really looked at this information for decades before even publishing them because they were very controversial. And any explanation of how things have changed over time deviated from what the church said, and so he had to be careful about what to say and how to say it for fear of repercussions from the church. So, after decades, he finally published his Origin of the Species in 1859, and he was really the first to suggest the idea with evidence of natural selection and survival of the fittest. So if we look at this theory and what a theory is, and just in general, just backing up, what a theory is. A theory, by definition, is a well-supported, testable explanation with evidence that is continually proven true. So in looking at that, his theory of evolution proves an explanation of how life has been changed and become more diverse over time. So evolution, we kind of have a misconception of evolution. We're just looking at how things have changed over time. We're given an explanation of how things have changed over time. We're not talking about how things initially came into existence. We're just talking about how different species have changed over time and the evidence that we look at to decide that. So if we move on to essential question number 3, what is natural selection specifically, and what evidence did Darwin see that helped him to form his theory? Darwin exclaimed that organisms do change over time. And for instance, if farmers can artificially select the best traits, then nature can as well. So if farmers want to have, now keep in mind that purple corn is dominant. And we should see in nature more purple corn than yellow corn, but we've said that yellow corn is more desirable. It tastes better. So farmers artificially select that trait and then breed it. We often say that, for instance, strawberries, the bigger strawberries, the juicier the strawberries, the better they're going to taste. The consumer wants to buy bigger strawberries, so we artificially select those traits and breed the strawberries to make that available for the consumer. It's better business, it's better for the consumer, it's better for the farmer, and everyone is happy. And again, so if farmers can artificially select the best traits, then nature can as well. And that's what the idea of natural selection is. Organisms that are best able to survive those traits will be chosen, and have offspring that are fit and able to survive. Those that are not fit will die, and therefore they will not reproduce, and those traits will not be carried on to the next generation. So one of the videos that we will watch, or we might have watched by the time you listen to this, gives an example of how natural selection works. If you and your buddy come across a bear in the forest, you don't have to be faster than the bear. You just have to be faster than your friend. You live, your friend gets eaten by the bear, and your faster trait lives on, can be passed on to generation. Now that's a terrible example to think about, but it happens in nature all the time. Think of a bunch of giraffes in the savannah. Right? When they're being preyed upon by lions, the slower, you don't have to be, if you're a giraffe, you don't have to be faster than lions, you just have to be faster than the giraffe sitting next to you. You live, your faster gene gets to be passed on, the slower gene dies with that generation. So that is natural selection. Nature chooses which traits are best able to survive and get passed on. So when we look at Darwin's evidence, what specifically did Darwin study? Well, when he was looking at the Galapagos Islands, he noticed that there was the same species of bird throughout the islands, the finch. And what he noticed was that some finch had, or each finch had a specific beak that suited what kind of food they wanted to eat. And of course, different foods equaled different beaks. You had a beak that was specified to eat insects, a beak that was specified to eat seeds, a beak that was specified to eat birds and fruit, and so, or grubs, or to dig for the insects, or to eat leaves. And so that he theorized that the different habitats have different organisms based on what they eat. And so the environment then, he concluded, determined the characteristics. When the birds were separated, those that were best suited to eat insects, those beaks, that trait for that beak was passed on to the offspring. Those that did not have this type of beak might have found it more difficult to eat the insects, and they either had to leave or they died. And that, either way, the trait left the gene pool. So if we look at, and here's another example of, tortoises that were better suited for the environment. Here was a ground feeder and here's a bush feeder. Different characteristics that fit whatever they decided to eat. So if we look at the last question, how the process of natural selection occurs with specific examples. And these are for the major explanations is how natural selection happens. There are variations which exist in nature, differences in the expression of a trait, inheritance, we often call that adaptations, the traits that can be passed on to the offspring, the desirable traits, struggle for existence, we often refer to as competition. The more organisms are produced, then the environment can support, and the best adapted organisms survive and reproduce, and the others die. And then the change over time. Species change over time in response to the environment, but all come from a common ancestor. We talked a little bit about this in classification. So if we look at variation, again in your notes, make sure that you have a sort of a definition of what a variation is and some examples. A variation is naturally exists in all populations, exists within all species, and only those that survive reproduce and pass on the genes to the next offspring. So what we're looking at, what you should write in your notes, a variation is a difference in trait. That's what a variation is. It's a difference in trait. Those that survive reproduce and pass on the genes to the next generation. Those that don't die with it. Here you have different variations of peppers. Some are more desirable than others in certain situations. So if we look at some examples of variations, again, we have mutations that can change the DNA sequence and the proteins they code for. You could have gene shuffling during meiosis and crossing over, or random matings in natural selection. So these are all sources or examples of variations. The next bit of evidence, we look at adaptations, or in your notes, inheritance. They mean the same thing. So inheritance or adaptations are just characteristics or behaviors that give one organism an advantage over another. And the adaptations increase chances of survival and reproduction, and only those best suited to their environment will survive and reproduce. So you can take a look at this little comic there. So example of adaptations, you have camouflage, and that allows organisms to blend into the environment. Here we have a bottom feeding fish, the two eyes right there on the top of its head, and it blends in with the rocks. Here you have a snake. This is a flounder. And here you have a rattlesnake that blend in. You have mimicry. An organism might mimic or copy the appearance of an organism for protection or other advantages. And for instance, that might avoid predation or avoid competition. So if you're a bird, you might mimic something that scares off a predator. Something like a hoverfly or a wasp. Birds avoid the hoverfly because they think it's a wasp. Pretty clever. Now the third explanation of how natural selection occurs, the struggle for existence, competition. More organisms are produced than the environment can support. Organisms fight for food, water, land, and mates. That's what creates competition. So it's a way of a struggle for existence, keeping populations in check. Example, you have polar bears, you have deer. And the last explanation is a change over time. Right? A species, and this is a word that you should probably highlight, just a species is a group of the same kind of organism, and they can change over several generations to have different traits. For instance, the peppered moth. All right, used to, for instance, the white moth, before pollution, this happened in the Industrial Revolution, before the white moth blended in with the bark of the tree. And when the Industrial Revolution happened, put a whole lot of pollutants in the air, the tree bark actually stood the tree bark actually became darker. So the white moth stuck out, and the dark moth actually was able to survive. So you had sort of a shift in population. So different genes can be more favorable and expressed throughout time, but those expressions can certainly change based on the environment and cause a shift in the gene pool. So before pollution, you had more white moths than dark moths, and after pollution, you had more dark moths than white moths. So this concludes the first part of the notes of a little bit of information behind the theories of evolution and the explanations of how, or the important scientists, and then the explanations of how natural selection occurs. So please have these notes ready for class, and if you have any questions, please feel free to see or speak with Mr. Matthews.